Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My name is Jane Norman, the ABC's National Regional Affairs reporter and a director here at the club. Our guest today is Trade Minister Don Farrell, marking his first anniversary in the job, and what better place to do that. The past 12 months has seen China ease its trade sanctions against Australia, most tariffs lifted with India, and a free trade deal come into effect with the UK. But it's a bigger deal with the EU that is proving a bit more elusive. Perhaps the Minister will give us an update on that today. You can follow the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @PressClubAust or #NPC. Please join me in welcoming Don Farrell.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jane. It's good to see you again, and good luck in your new role. It's great to be here amongst so many friends and so many familiar faces for my first talk at the Press Club. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. There's almost too many people to acknowledge in this room today, but I'd like to particularly give a special acknowledgement to Lena Miroshnichenko. Lena and her husband, the Ambassador Vasyl Miroshnichenko, have represented the people of Ukraine passionately and strongly here in Australia, and I want them to know that Ukraine's fight is our fight. And yeah. And I should also mention my wife, Nympha, who's joined us today. She should get a clap too, I think. It's been just over a year since the Albanese Labor government took office, and exactly 1 year to the day since I had the honour of being sworn in as Special Minister of State and the Minister for Trade and Tourism. When the Prime Minister asked me to take on these roles in Cabinet, he was clear that his vision was long-term, was one of stability and common sense reform after what he viewed as a decade of inaction and political uncertainty. My mother would always tell me that self-praise is no recommendation, but yeah, she used to say that a lot. But with 40 years of negotiating experience under my belt, I confidently committed to the Prime Minister that I would perform my duties as he expected, whether it be externally and internationally as the Minister for Trade and Tourism, or internally and domestically as Special Minister of State. It's my fervent belief that my role is to quietly pursue agreement and consensus, remaining solely focused on delivering an outcome, even if it means rejecting the media attention that many of the comes second nature to elected representatives. As Special Minister of State, a portfolio that remains a mystery to many of you. That's where all the bodies are buried. I'm proudly working to improve transparency and integrity across our electoral system, delivering long overdue workplace reform to the Parliament, and most importantly for a lifelong unionist, advocating for our staff. As Minister for Trade and Tourism, I'm working to support industries still recovering from the uncertainty of the pandemic, negotiating new agreements for our producers and exporters around the world, and working to resolve outstanding impediments. And it's in this international work that will make up the majority of my comments to you here today. 12 months ago, things looked quite different. We inherited a raft of fractured relationships with key trading partners, and a decade of inaction saw us trailing the majority of the world. Our politics was dominated and often led by egotism, chest-beating and bluster, not in the national interest, but to pursue short-term domestic attention. But this government, led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, was straight out of the blocks, getting to work to repair our reputation and move forward. While we've seen good progress, we continue to operate in a challenging global environment. Treasury predicts that global growth will slide from 3.4% last year back to 2.7% this year. And globally, inflation is proving more stubborn than previously anticipated, even just a few months ago. And as the war in Ukraine reminds us day by day, there are clear links between the strategic environment and the health of the global economy. The economic impact of climate change continues to grow, and we cannot forget the industries still recovering from the pandemic. Of course, none of that is news. We knew that what we were facing, a difficult operating environment, well before we took office a year ago. But more trade, not less, is a key part of how we build the secure and stable economic future that we want, which is why we've worked so hard in the last year to advance our trade agenda and to do everything in our power to bolster and support stable trade and investment flows. It's why this government has spent the last year working to diversify our trading relationships, to invest in Australian manufacturing, Australian innovation and Australian skills, to defend and reform global trade rules, to make sure the rules of the road can respond to the contemporary challenges, and to ensure the trade delivers for everyday Australians, even though cheaper prices, improved competition and a lower cost of living. And it's why we're committed to free, fair and open trade, where the rules of the game are known and respected. That's something that all trade and investment ministers across the nation agree upon. In April, I chaired the first face-to-face gathering of Commonwealth, State and Territory trade and investment ministers since 2019. I convened this group to develop a united, coherent approach to advancing Australia's trade and investment opportunities. We're a federation, and while international relationships affect us at individual levels, it's my job to ensure that we are working in unison. On balance, trade is a force for good. It's a key lever of the Australian economy. Its benefits flow to all aspects of everyday life. More trade means more well-paying jobs, more national income and more opportunities for business and for workers. In an evolving and often challenging global environment, trade helps us enable the economic strength and resilience that is central to our national power alongside defence and diplomacy. Our terms of trade are the best that I've seen in my lifetime. We've just recorded a $15 billion trade surplus for the month of March. A strong trade surplus means Australian exporters are doing well. And when our exporters do well, so does our budget. Our decision to return 87% of revenue upgrades, including from strong export earnings, back to the budget, helps us pay back the $1 trillion of debt that we inherited from the Coalition. And a stronger budget, bottom line, helps to pay for things like Medicare, JobSeeker and rent assistance to improve the lives of all Australians. Trade translates into jobs. 1 in 4 Australian jobs are connected to trade. And jobs in exporting sectors like manufacturing, mining, agriculture and international education boasts incomes 43% higher than non-export related jobs. The pandemic restrictions have shown us clearly that the movement of people holds the same strategic and economic value as the movement of goods and services. That's why in tourism, one of our largest service exports pre-COVID, we're supporting major events and visitors to return. More than 350,000 businesses are directly involved in the tourism sector, with around a third of those in regional Australia. We're seeing visitor numbers inch up as a whole. Those visitors, whether they're students, skilled workers or recreational tourists, are vital, especially in regional areas. As of May, we've welcomed back almost 500,000 international students. That's an increase of more than 100% since the borders reopened in December 2021. Our international education sector represents our 4th largest export market, And just as we need to diversify our export markets to grow and protect our economy, so too our international education offering. The post-COVID recovery of the aviation sector is helping bring new tourists to Australia via brand new routes from New Delhi to Melbourne, Tokyo to Cairns and San Francisco to Brisbane. Over the years ahead, we know international trade, including our visitor economy, must continue to be a driver of Australian prosperity. And we're committed to sharing the benefits of that prosperity as widely through the community as possible. One of our biggest priorities has been to work to stabilise our relationship with China, by far our largest trading partner. We've been clear on our position with China from day one. We want a stable and prosperous trading relationship and the full resumption of trade. Since the day I took on the job as Australia's Trade and Tourism Minister, it's been the biggest test of our commitment to stability, to pursue discussion over disputes and dialogue rather than bluster. And we're making progress. We've held a range of ministerial meetings, including the Prime Minister and the Chinese President in Bali last year, followed by the Foreign Minister and I, both visiting Beijing in recent months. During my trip to Beijing last month, I co-chaired the first in-person meeting between Australian and Chinese trade ministers since 2019. I told my counterpart that we want to see all remaining trade impediments removed as soon as possible, and we agreed to step up dialogue under our existing free trade agreement and other platforms to resolve these outstanding issues. And it was welcome news that shortly after my visit, China announced it would resume imports of Australian timber. That follows positive developments in coal, cotton, copper ores and concentrate. And in Detroit last week, I had the opportunity to reinforce to my Chinese counterpart that we'd like to see that progress continue. Our barley producers have done an excellent job finding alternative markets, but we want them to again have the choice of exporting to Chinese industry. And as I'm sure you know, we want to see our quality wines back on Chinese kitchen tables. I've seen firsthand the real human impact of the tariffs on wine, with neighbours leaving grapes to wilt on the vine rather than suffer the uncertainty of the global market. These trade impediments are not an academic notion. They affect real people, businesses with overheads, families with bills to pay, and workers reliant on the income. And I'd like to acknowledge the hard work and patience of industry, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Austrade, the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, and the embassy staff on the ground in China for their efforts to resolve the trade impediments and maintain our presence on the world stage. These, yeah, and we should give them a little clap, I think. And I'm so pleased to see so many people from all of my departments that I'm responsible for here today. And if you want some advice on how we're going with the EU Free Trade Agreement, of course we've got the negotiator here today. Where is Alison? Stand up. Just there, right, here we go. So if you've got any questions, Alison's the person to ask. But unfortunately, these issues won't be resolved overnight. But as I've made clear, it's my job to persist and persevere until we have a favourable outcome for our producers, exporters and workers. At the same time, over-reliance on any single trading partner comes with risks. Across the private sector, any business that relied on a single client would be destined for failure. So too for our global trading economies. We've learnt valuable lessons over the last few years, and I encourage all Australian businesses to continue with their diversification plans and to take advantage of new and emerging markets. It's one thing to get a free trade agreement written up. It's quite another thing to get the benefits out of that free trade agreement. And part of my job is to encourage Australians to go out there and pursue those opportunities. Let's take India. We've got Frances Listen in the audience today. She can tell you about what's going on with the second Indian agreement. People say, oh, it's difficult to do business in India. Well, that's what they used to say about China 30 or 40 years ago. You've got to go in there, you've got to have boots on the ground, and you've got to work at it. That's the way you get it. And smart businesses are those who will continue to spread their wings and diversify. A key component of our trade diversification agenda is entering into new and comprehensive free trade agreements. Those agreements mean that Australians can choose from more products at better prices. Just yesterday, the Australia-UK Free Trade Agreement entered into force, with 99% of Australian goods now entering the UK completely tariff-free. That means companies like Australia's Capilano honey will now enter the UK market tariff-free for the first time. Founded by two brothers in Brisbane in 1953, Capilano now sources its 100% pure Australian honey from over 800 beekeeping families, supporting local jobs and ensuring it has the largest ongoing supply in the industry. It means Australians buying a new Nissan made in Sunderland in the UK will save up to $2,000 in import duties. The same goes for the initial free trade agreement with India. Reductions in tariffs means that companies like Fletcher's, Australia's largest exporter of sheep meat, can boost their premium exports to India's fast-growing middle class. In fact, in the first 5 months of the free trade agreement with India coming into force, it's estimated that Australian businesses have benefited from lower tariffs on more than $10 billion worth of exports. Negotiations are moving swiftly to boost our trade agreement with India, the fastest growing large economy in the world, with a market of over 1.4 billion people. We're deepening our engagement with Southeast Asia, including through our Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040, which will be completed this year. And we're looking forward to signing the upgrade of the ASEAN-Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement in August to make sure it keeps delivering for Australian businesses, workers and consumers. But trade agreements aren't the only way to diversify trade and boost our trade. The government's export credit agency, Export Finance Australia, has helped businesses export to 72 countries in the last 12 months alone, supporting more than $9 billion in contracts and projects. And in 2024, we'll participate in the next World Expo in Osaka in Japan. Japan is our second largest trading partner, and our exporters have built strong, trusted relationships in the country over many decades. Our participation in Osaka will provide a platform for Australian businesses to deepen their existing business relationships and build new ones across sectors like clean energy and tourism. All of the work of our trade partners in the last year and what we've achieved in the challenging global economy highlight what Australia brings to the international economy. We're a trusted partner. We're safe and reliable. We keep our promises and we play by the rules. And we'll be working with our trade partners to keep our international system fair and open. Days after I was sworn in as the Trade Minister, I joined by Assistant Minister Tim Ayres to represent Australia at the 12th World Trade Organisation Ministerial Conference. This was a conference that many thought would not yield outcomes, but we participated fully and agreed to end harmful fisheries subsidies by working closely with our Pacific Island partners and a path forward to WTO reform, including the addressing of the dispute settlement system, which is currently not working as it should. We're an island nation. We need organisations like the WTO to be functional. WTO rules underpin the global trading system, a system that is absolutely fundamental to Australia's prosperity and security, a system vital to our region's economic progress and stability. One major challenge, as we all know, is the global issue of climate change and how we move forward to net zero. The Albanese government's strong action on climate change has finally put us back in step with the rest of the world. In almost every meeting I have had with international colleagues, there's been an audible sigh of relief that there's been a change in direction when it comes to action on climate change. We've legislated our net zero targets and we're considering the economic impacts of climate change in all of our trade agreement negotiations. As we look to the future, Australia has opportunities to seize, and this government is making sure we're in the best position to take advantage of those opportunities. We want to be a renewable energy superpower, and we will. We're already working with key partners to support trade and investment required to realise our ambition. Last year, I signed the world's first green economy agreement with Singapore, a key bilateral and regional partner, to ensure that we work together to transition our economies to net zero. Australia is the world's #1 producer of lithium and titanium, and a top 5 producer of cobalt and rare earths. These critical minerals are needed to power batteries, electric vehicles, solar panels and wind turbines that the world's going to need to make that transition to net zero. An example is Neon, a leading French independent producer of renewable energy and a major player in the world stage. Neon has invested $3 billion in Australian renewables, including a large-scale wind farm, solar farms, battery storage facilities like those in my home state of South Australia, and Victorian Big Battery. Australia needs investment, not only for extraction, but also to boost processing and production. For Australians, that means more jobs in the rapidly growing renewable energy industry and cheaper energy prices. For the world, it means clean energy from a trusted, reliable source. Australia is a safe and stable investment destination. We're committed to remaining a reliable and trusted supplier of energy to our trading partners and to supporting them through the energy transition. Last week I was in Detroit for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, where 14 participating member countries announced a new significant trade agreement on supply chains. This will enable us to work with partners from across the Indo-Pacific who represent more than 40% of the global GDP and make us more resilient against the kinds of disruptions and shortages that we've seen as a result of COVID and other global developments. We're still in negotiations with the European Union, and the Ambassador has talked about those negotiations for the Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. It's a huge market, 450 million people, and a GDP of around $24 trillion. That's why a trade deal with the EU is such a top priority for this government. Put simply, it means growth, investment, jobs and higher wages. It's a complex negotiation, and I can tell you today that I'm travelling to Brussels next week to again sit down face-to-face with the EU Trade Commissioner and find a way through. He's a Latvian, and when I'm talking to him, he reminds me of my doctor, who was also Latvian, and they talk with that exact same mannerism, and I close my eyes and I can see my doctor talking there. So I'm hoping he's going to give us the right medicine. But I've made it clear that Australia will not sign a deal just for the sake of it, will not sign a deal unless it's in our national interests and includes new substantial market access for our quality products. Again, this will require calm persistence, continued dialogue and a willingness to compromise and find common ground. Our producers, exporters and workers deserve the best deal that we can negotiate, and we will persist, even if it means that the negotiations extend beyond mid-year. Did you hear that, Ambassador? We're prepared to extend negotiations if we can't get an immediate result. Negotiations will continue to be tough, but an outcome must be fair. That concept, fairness, is a key thread that runs through our approach to trade. We believe that the benefits of increased trade must be shared across the Australian economy. Ultimately, we believe that trade is a force for good for every Australian, and so will continue to be the government of free, fair and open trade. And I, not one to break with tradition, will continue to quietly persist and persevere for the best outcomes for Australia across the world. Thank you very much for your time.
Just give the Minister a moment to have a sip of water. If I can ask you a question with your Tourism Minister hat on, in Senate estimates this morning, an interesting issue was raised, and it's about the Socceroos match with Argentina in China coming up in a couple of weeks' time. And we understand that Football Australia, as part of the deal to get the Socceroos to play in China, were given a fee or funding from a group called China Rainbow International Investment. If you have a look at that group's website, you'll see that they're controlled by the United Front Work Department. And I was wondering, as Tourism Minister, are you comfortable, is the government comfortable helping to facilitate these kind of business deals with an arm of the United Front Work Department as it has here for the Socceroos? Is this appropriate?
Look, I'm not familiar with the issue that you've just raised, and I'm happy to follow it up and come back with an answer for you.
All right, thank you. Our first question, Tom McElroy from the Fin Review.
Thanks for your speech, Minister. Thanks, Jane. Minister, in Beijing a few weeks ago, there was clearly goodwill between you and your Chinese counterpart. At the time of the trip, you talked about a pathway to the stabilisation of relations and the end of the year as a possible destination point. With regard to Bali and the other things that you've talked about, what are the steps on that pathway, and does the end of the year still ring true?
Thanks, Tom. Look, I think it does. I had another good meeting with Minister Wang last week in Detroit. It was interesting that before he met with me, he met with Gina Raimondo, the American Commerce Secretary, and the comments in the American media was that the Americans are following the Australian pattern of stabilising the relationship. So that was a good meeting, both from my point of view and obviously Secretary Raimondo's point of view. We've managed to get a number of products back into China, and we've seen the ones I've mentioned today, including the announcement in respect of timber. Bali is next cab off the rank. As you know, we were prepared to, as an act of goodwill, suspend our WTO application against China in return for the Chinese government fast-tracking their review of the 80% tariffs that are currently applied to Australian barley. That process is close to completed, and the messages I got back from our officials in China was that things are going in the right direction. So I'd be hopeful that when that decision is finally made, that it'll be a positive decision and we can get Australian barley back into China. And I met with the Western Australian barley group yesterday just to talk about how that might happen. We've said to Minister Wang that we think that the template that we've established with barley should be the process that we look for with wine. And I reiterated that at our meeting in Detroit on Friday. Again, it was another positive, warm and friendly meeting, I think would be fair to say. So things are progressing. The problems didn't occur overnight, as I've said before. They're not going to be resolved overnight. My job is to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And I think the direction is heading in the right direction, but there's still a lot more work to go. And I don't want to build up expectations, but I do think that bit by bit, and we discussed some other impediments at that meeting on Friday, but I think bit by bit we're going to get back to a stabilised pre-COVID, pre-bans relationship with China, and that's obviously going to be good for Australian wine and food producers, but also good for Chinese consumers who are looking to buy our products.
And just with the barley review, would you accept anything less than a full revocation of the sanctions?
No.
Right, so all sanctions go or no deal?
Yeah, we've got a free trade agreement with China. It's got certain provisions in it, and we want the Chinese government to comply with their obligations under that free trade agreement. And that's our expectation, and that's what we've asked for. And if we find ourselves in a situation where, having shown an act of goodwill to suspend our WTO application, and we don't get the result we want, well, we've made it clear to the Chinese government that we'll resume that application.
Right, our next question is Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times.
Minister, thank you. Look, I want to take you to your mysterious Special Minister of State portfolio. I don't know whether this is one of your before-mentioned bodies, but I would love to know if there is still active consideration for additional territory representation, indeed wider representation added on, and look, where would they all sit if that is correctly coming in?
Well, you can never have enough politicians, can you, in this country? Look, I don't want to preempt the meeting of the outcome of the inquiry that's almost about to be released, but I'm happy enough to give consideration to that issue, as I've said in the past. But there is a process here. After each election, the committee, the electoral committee, examines the outcome of the last election. They take submissions from a variety of groups, and of course they then come down with some recommendations which are very close to being released. We are in this situation, of course, where since the last time the numbers were reviewed across the country in 1984, there's 10 million more Australians. So we have had a very significant increase in population with no increase in the number of members of Parliament. So, look, I understand the issue. You know, ACT is growing very strongly. Northern Territory is growing very strongly. And it's an issue I think we need to address and give consideration to.
Our next question is from Rhiannon Down from The Australian.
Hello, Rhiannon Down from The Australian. Is Taiwan entitled to be considered for CPTPP membership? And can you name any reason why Taiwan's application to join the CPTPP should not be processed?
Thank you. Yes, it used to be called the TPP, and it was a fairly easy word to pay. But when Canada came in, of course, became the CPTPP. So we had a meeting of all of the members of the CPTPP in Detroit last week, and the whole consideration, not just of Taiwan, but the other 7 or 8 economies that would like to join that group were given some consideration. The situation at the moment is that for the past couple of years, we have been considering the first of the new applicants, and that was the United Kingdom. I think it's probably fair to say it was a relatively slow and torturous proceedings that even at this point haven't quite been finalised. We've got in principle agreement, but there's still a range of things that need to be done to finalise that agreement, and we're hopeful that all of those will be completed by July when the group meet in New Zealand. But even then, it's going to require countries to make decisions about approving that new accession in their own countries. We took the view that let's finalise the United Kingdom, and after we've done that, we'll give consideration to all of the other applicants who would like to join. I think it's fair to say there was a mood in the room that let's just deal with the UK situation, let's settle that down before we move on to the next step. And that doesn't just apply to Taiwan, that applies to all of the other applicants to the request to come into that agreement. That agreement is a popular agreement, as you know, and serves Australia very well. In fact, it gives us access to countries that we otherwise don't have free trade agreements with. So it's a very good agreement. It's delivering good results for Australia, and that is why I think there are so many applicants to come into that agreement.
Our next question, Daniel Hurst from The Guardian.
Daniel Hurst from Guardian Australia. Moving to investor-state dispute settlement, ISDS, which, as you know, has been used by Big Tobacco on plain packaging laws and more recently by Clive Palmer. It's clear that the government, and you've said it again in recent weeks, that you won't be signing any new agreements that include ISDS clauses. But what about existing agreements? The Labor platform said Labor will set up a full-time negotiating team within DFAT whose sole job will be negotiate the removal of ISDS clauses and the reinstatement of labour market testing. Has that happened, and if not, why not?
Well, look, there's certainly been plenty of discussions in the department on this issue. We've made it very clear that in respect of new agreements, we will not include ISDS applications. And the reason for that is that they're simply misused. You can see the dispute currently by Clive Palmer in respect of using one of these provisions. We are working through all of our commitments in our platform. Of course, my announcement in respect of ISDS is a part commitment to dealing with issues in our platform, but bit by bit we will resolve and make sure that we implement all of the items in our party's platform, which will be renewed at the August national conference.
Do you have a SWAT team trying to negotiate changes to existing agreements?
Look, we have people doing lots of things in the department, and all of my officials are well aware of the Labor Party's policies in respect of trade.
Melissa Code from the Mandarin.
Hi Minister, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned a conscious effort not to insert these bad superlatives, egotism, chest beating and bluster, and they are all superlatives I think of when I think of the GST debate. The reason I mention that is because GST and the way state revenue flows to the state jurisdictions has a big bearing on the basic services which can be provided to the higher education sector and the international students you talk as being very important to Australia's economy. When we think of any cost of living article or headline or news package which goes to a food bank, there's a large number of international students who feature in that story of struggling and surviving and questions about dignity in their lives. And we don't want to, that's not much of a sell, is it, to the international student community? So if basic services like health, accommodation and so on, which fall into the state jurisdictions, rely on this question of state revenue flowing from GST, what's your position on the methodology and also the no worse off subsidy, which is going to wind up soon enough such that it impacts future state budgets next year when they talk about their forward estimates?
Well, I'm not the Treasurer, of course, but I think if he were here, he would definitely rule out an increase in the GST. We do find ourselves in a difficult financial position. To try and put this into perspective, I was previously a member of the Rudd Ministry. When we lost power in 2013, our debt was $300 billion. When we came to office 12 months ago, that debt had ballooned out to $1 trillion. So in 9 years, it had increased more than double. So we've got a difficult economic set of circumstances to deal with. We have been fortunate with the terms of trade being so favourable in our interest, but one of the things that we've decided to do with that money is to pay down the debt. Now, when you think about $1 trillion worth of debt, that's a lot of money. When interest rates were 0.01%, well, it wasn't all that expensive to repay it. But as interest rates have escalated, and we've got our friends from Westpac here today, I'll tell you about how interest rates have gone up. So we've got a big job to stabilise the economy. We've tried to look after what we believe are the most disadvantaged people in our community. We've committed $15 billion in the most recent budget to try and assist Australians who are doing it tough at the moment. Can we do more? Would we like to do more? Of course we would, but we're going to have to do it in the constraints of the economic circumstances in which we find ourselves.
And on the bluster and chest beating issue, do you accept, in particular as a senator for South Australia, that the public discourse and debate around GST, which characterises states as winners and losers, is unhelpful?
Yeah, I do.
Thanks.
Our next question is Nicole Hegarty from the ABC.
Nicole Hegarty from ABC News. At the end of last year, you said the question of whether an EU FTA would be able to proceed or was possible without Australia conceding ground on geographic indicators was a hypothetical question, and you would have more of an idea in February. Now it's June and you've just let us know of your travel plans in the coming week. Are you expecting to come back with some more concrete ideas around that? Or should your Australian vintner contacts turn their collective minds and budgets to designing new labels for their Prosecco?
Not just yet. Every opportunity I get to speak with the Europeans, I explain this to them, that in the aftermath of World War II, we accepted lots and lots of European migrants to this country. They obviously brought their culture, they brought their family, but in many cases they brought their food and their wine. And in that period since 70 years since World War II, of course, they've developed their own industries in Australia. Words like Prosecco, like Feta, like Halloumi, you go through it. All of those are now names which we are comfortable with in Australia. We know exactly what it means. We know exactly what the product is. For these people who have produced those products, this is not just an economic issue. This is a way in which they've maintained links with their mother country. So for them, it's not just an economic issue, it's an emotional issue. And I've been in the room with Prosecco makers who've simply burst into tears at the prospect of losing access to that name because they feel so strongly attached to the name. So I've tried to express as strongly as I can just why Australian producers want to continue to be able to use those names. What will be the outcome of the final negotiations? Well, I can't tell you that at the moment, but I continue to say to the Europeans, and I can say it to the ambassador here today, you have to understand this is not just an economic issue for Australia, it's also an emotional issue.
So will it be at the top of the list next week in discussions?
I don't know about the top of the list, but they're all equal in my view. There's a whole range of issues that are going to be discussed. We want greater access to European agricultural markets. We think we've been left behind there. Europeans have got a list of items, including the GIs that you've mentioned, the luxury car tax, and a range of issues. I don't want to prioritise them, at least not at this stage. They'll all be subjects for discussion. My job is to represent Australia's national interests. How do we go about making a final assessment? Well, we look at the things that are good for Australia, we look at the things that might be bad for Australia, and make an assessment. Is this good in Australia's national interest? And if it is, well then we proceed with it. If it's not, well then we don't proceed with it.
Our next question is from Tess Economou from AAP.
Thank you very much for your speech, Minister. Just ahead of the Prime Minister's visit to Vietnam, what sort of products and services do you think have the potential to grow?
I've just come back from Vietnam and to be honest with you, I was blown away with the opportunities that Vietnam now present. It's got a population of over 100 million people, mostly young people, very dynamic, a rising middle class and very keen to move from the status of a developed country or a developing country to the status of a developed country by 2045. I have to say I was blown away by the number of senior people I met, both in business and in government, who'd actually either been educated in Australia or educated by Australian universities in Vietnam, or who had children who are currently in Australia. So in terms of education, I think one of the greatest opportunities is in that education space, either more Australian universities setting up in either Ho Chi Minh or Hanoi, or sending more students. Now, interestingly enough, there are now, I think, 4 Vietnamese airlines flying directly into Australia. I launched the first flight of Vietjet from Ho Chi Minh to Brisbane. They told me privately that the next place they wanted to go to was Adelaide, and I very much encouraged them to do that. $60 airfares, Adelaide to Ho Chi Minh. So tourism is one, education is the other, but they've got a changing, in the past they tended to drink spirits. This rising middle class, wine is a great opportunity. One of my former employees who used to work for, before he worked for Austrade, used to work for me, him and his wife have set up a little pizza bar in Hanoi, and in Ho Chi Minh, and it's booming. So food, wine, education, and tourism. I think we've got some people here who could probably tell me the exact figures, but I'm pretty sure that the number of Vietnamese tourists to Australia and Australian tourists to Vietnam is higher than pandemic levels. One of the reasons is there's downward pressure on prices and plenty of availability.
Question, Andrew Tillett from the Fin Review.
Thanks, Jane. Andrew from the Fin and also board member here at the Press Club. Minister, thanks for your speech. Pivoting back to Special Minister of State hat, we're obviously going to have the voice referendum later this year. I think there's a feeling that the next cab off the rank referendum-wise should be the Republic referendum. But I was wondering if it might be time for a bit of constitutional housekeeping and have some other further referendums, particularly around things like around our electoral laws and parliamentary system and things like that. For example, things like Section 44, the carnage that caused with MPs a few years ago, things like fixed terms, 4-year fixed terms, going back to Karen's question about if you increase the size of the House, that obviously has the nexus where you'd have to increase the size of the Senate too. Yeah. And also something that it's dear to the Prime Minister's heart also when he was in the Gillard government was about constitutional recognition for local government as well. They're just sort of some of the issues that have sort of been bubbled up and we've had past referendums on them. Do you think it's time to maybe have a bit of a stock take and look at them as well?
Look, if referendums were easy, then of course we do nearly all of the things that you've just mentioned there. I think, unfortunately, referendums are hard, and it's, to be honest with you, it's been a very long time since any referendum proposed by a Labor government has been successful. What's the obligation? Well, you've got to get a majority of votes and a majority of states. So it's a high bar. I'm still optimistic that, well, firstly, I think the voice is the one that we should be proceeding with. We've tried the Republic; it didn't work. So I think the voice is the correct one. I mean, there's no other group of people in our community who've suffered such disadvantage as Indigenous Australians, and it's time that we had recognition in our constitution for them. In my capacity as Special Minister of State, I had the job of passing the machinery legislation for the referendum, and I know there's a lot of controversy about the general issue, but that went through the Senate unanimously. a couple of months ago, which I think is I took as a positive step, so that even people, for instance, like Pauline Hanson, did not oppose that legislation going through and, in fact, spoke in favour of it. But look, I think it's one bite at a time. This will be a difficult item to get through. Most referendums fail, even where you've got the support of both parties, and of course we don't have that here. They're hard to get up. So, no, I think the Prime Minister has made the right call here. He's passionate about this. He wants to see it. We've just seen in South Australia, the South Australian government introduce a voice to Parliament. So I think it's an idea whose time has come, and I'm looking forward to voting yes.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on the voice? You're saying it's going to be a difficult item to get through. Of course, history is against it simply because most referendums do fail in Australia. But looking at this specific one, your government is very firmly behind it. In all your years in politics, you've become renowned for your ability to, sense the mood, interpret polls. Where do you reckon the Yes campaign is at the moment? And would you be confident if, for example, the vote were held, tomorrow, this week, next month?
Well, if it was held this Saturday, I think it would get up. There would be a majority of Australians voting for it, and there would be a majority of states. If I can break the contingent down into three groups, people under 35, very overwhelmingly in favour of a voice to Parliament. People 35 to 55, pretty evenly split. People over 55, generally, a majority opposing. I think that young cohort will be enough to counter the no vote, and I think it'll be the young people who will deliver an Indigenous voice for Australia.
Right. Our next question is from Nick Stewart.
As an older person, perhaps I should say, I identify with the younger people, so I'll be voting yes.
Good on you.
You mentioned during your speech, though, that there was a degree to which stability and security was really important, rule of law. Here in the ACT, we have the government deciding to take over a recovery hospital. What's your feeling about, and talk about going to the High Court to try and prevent that taking place? What's your feeling about how that may be affecting other international people looking at investing in Australia? Because my understanding is that there are some people who are now, some investors, who are considering whether or not there is a degree of country risk.
Look, I have to say I would be surprised if it has any international implications. Obviously, the ACT government has made a decision in this over this issue. The only advice I would give the parties is, look, if there's a way of sorting this out by discussion rather than disputation, I use the same principles here that I would use in a trade negotiation. It's much better to resolve your issues by discussion and negotiation rather than ending up in the court. So I would encourage the parties to do that if that's possible at this stage.
Our next question is from Julie Hare from the Fin Review.
Mr Farrell, thank you so much for your speech. There's a bit of a love fest going on with India at the moment, as we've been evidenced by Anthony Albanese and Narendra Modi doing a lot of man-hugging. International students are actually critical to this. They are the fourth largest export sector, and Indian students are now just in number, just below those from China. We've seen a massive surge in Indian enrolments in the last year, well, less than a year, in the last 6 months. Unfortunately, not all are genuine. There are horror stories from universities losing 40 to 50% of their first-year Indian students within the first 6 months as they bail into cheaper, often dodgy colleges. In other words, they're using the student visa system as a backdoor to the workforce. How do you balance integrity of the education system with an increasingly open-door policies wrapped around promises of permanent residency?
Well, with hard work and monitoring. I actually thought that the number of Indian students had actually taken over from the Chinese, so that, no, that's not right. Well, Indians are right up there, whether it be as students, as tourists, because they've come back in very significant numbers. And again, my friends from Tourism Australia would be able to tell us just how many numbers have come in, and of course as migrants themselves. So they are becoming a very significant portion of our community, and not just going to the cities. If you go to any rural area in Australia, you'll see significant numbers of people from the subcontinent. We want to encourage those links, whether it be by migration, tourists or students, but we want them to comply with the rules. And I just think increased monitoring is the way to do it. We don't want to discourage them from coming to this country. We welcome them. You know, we've still got massive labour shortages in this country, so they represent an opportunity of filling some of those gaps, particularly in the hospitality area, in the tourism area. But look, it's simply a case of monitoring, and if we have discovered that people are not complying with the rules, well, then that's a good thing. It means that the system's working.
Thank you. And our next question is Tom McElroy again from the AFR.
Thanks, Jane. Thank you, Minister. It was fascinating to hear your assessment of the age-by-age breakdown.
I love your tie.
Oh, thanks, Minister. Yours too. It was fascinating to hear your assessment of the demographics for The Voice. The campaigns on both sides are looking at states like Queensland and Western Australia as possible weak spots for the yes case. Do you agree with those assessments? Give us a around the grounds of the states and territories.
No, I don't. I think the Voice will get up in all states.
Great.
All right, and our last question today is Karen Barlow from the Canberra Times.
Hello again. Well, on The Voice and particularly the pamphlets, do you have concerns about the tone or how they're going to be worked out, the words, so on the yes and no side? Do you have any warning about the tone or concerns that were, I guess, the issue raised by the AEC is it could get to the point where there's only one side that gets mailed out?
Look, I hope it doesn't get to that stage. I was involved in... So, let's go back a little bit. The original decision was for no pamphlet, and that created perhaps an impression that we were seeking to hide things from the Australian people. The Prime Minister correctly made a decision to reverse that call, and I was the one that had the job of negotiating, particularly with the coalition, about the reintroduction of that into the legislation. During that discussion, you know, there was contemplation about what the words would say. There is a process under the Referendums Act as to how this goes about, and you've mentioned the figure of 2,000 words. I'm hopeful that there will be a respectful debate, including in the Parliament, about what the arguments will be on either side of the cases. So at this point, I think it'll be a respectful discussion. I think the wording will be a respectful explanation. There's always two sides to the argument. You've got a yes and a no case, but at this point, I'd still be very hopeful that we can sort out a pamphlet that accurately explains to the Australian people what the yes case is and what the no case is without any acrimony.
All right, Minister, we know you have to get back to Senate estimates, so thank you very much. This is probably a break from it here. Thank you for your time today. Please accept our gift of membership to the club and also a nice Canberra drop, which maybe you would bring on your trip to the EU next week or to Europe next week.
Okay, well,
that's it. And thank you for your time today. Please join us.
Why don't we have a little photo holding it?